They said it had come back after 40 years, like a rumor rolled down from the ridges and left on the barroom counter with the last of the beer cans. I remember how that exact phrase slapped the room quiet the night old Joe Hendricks told it. Returned after 40 years, as if the woods itself had kept a long breath and then let it out. I was 45 that year, the Ford still running on borrowed patience, my hands dark with mill sawdust and whatever grief you can tuck into the seams of a flannel shirt. I never expected to be part of a story that people would whisper about, much less the one who would keep the small, stubborn objects that suggested something true and troublemaking lived in the shadows of the Douglas firs. If you want to hear the whole thing, stay with me till the end. If this channel helps keep these old stories from vanishing, subscribe and leave a like. It won't bring anything back, but it will keep a few of the stones in the pile from being lost. On the 17th of September 1973, I walked into a clearing to check a stray beehive and came home wearing a bruise the size of a coin on my hip and with my left shoulder dangling loose like a coat off a peg. I wasn't entirely sure then whether I had stumbled into something or it had stumbled into me. I remember the light, an honest, thin September sun that burned off the fog in one clean sweep, turning the wet moss silver for a minute. The creek 7 paces downhill had the regular hiss of water on rock. I had the old dog, Maggie, on a leash and a thermos of coffee wrapped in a rag. It was the kind of morning that smells of wood smoke and river mud and a little of the inside of a closed house when you open the door on a cold day. The first thing I saw wasn't a face. It was a hand, enormous, the skin between the knuckles like old rope, the pads thick and calloused, tipped with dark, blunt nails. And it was pressed to a fallen log as if testing the sound. It had the same tamped-in look of a man who'd used his hands his whole life. When it turned, the thing attached to it peered at me with eyes that were a little too round and a little too close set for any deer or bear I knew. The fur caught the light in streaks of chestnut and gray. It smelled like sour leaf mold and the sweet rot of sap. It made a sound under its breath that was not a bear's growl nor a man's cough, more like the low-throated call of something that had kept itself out of the human world and liked that arrangement. You learn quick when you are alone with something that large and alive. My first movement was stupid. I reached without thinking, maybe to scratch my neck, maybe to judge if it was real. The creature's arm shot out, not to hit, not in the way the hunters would later do what they did. Its fingers closed like a question over the shoulder I didn't know how to steady. That pressure, that pull, it was a hand that knew how fragile shoulder blades and bone could be. I tore away and fell. The thermos rolled into the leaves and split its slick coffee across the moss. I remember the heat of the coffee and the cold of the air and the way the thing watched me crawl to my truck. They wanted to call it one thing in town and another in the paper. To the men at the bar, it was a Sasquatch, a hareback, half man and full trouble. To the school kids, it was a monster you could scare your cousins with on Halloween. To me, in the months that followed, it was a being who had the bad manners of not explaining itself and the good sense to leave me with my pride intact. I went to my sister in Concrete and patched up the shoulder with whiskey and the county clinic surgeon's bill, and I told myself the tale I thought would make sense. Clumsy hunting dog, bad footing, an animal I couldn't name. But I kept waking with the taste of wet fur in my mouth and animal breath on my face, and that is its own kind of proof. For the first weeks, it kept to the edge of things. You can read every headline and every front-page claim in the world, but that is not what teaches you the habits of a creature. What teaches you is the way it arranges cones in a neat circle on my porch one morning, how it stacked small stones at the head of the creek like someone pointing with a blunt finger, or how it left a single cedar bough tucked under the chair where Martha used to sit. Martha, God rest her, had been gone 4 years then. She had been the soft center of everything that steadied me. When the bough appeared, I couldn't tell whether it was sympathy or mockery. It took me a month to touch the hair. One morning, the porch was empty, and the bough had been replaced with a small tuft of fur, a reddish curl the size of my fist resting in the hollow of the chair like a tear. I cupped it without thinking and felt ashamed at the warmth I expected and did not find. People collect things to prove themselves alive to themselves. Polaroids, ticket stubs, a child's shoe, and for a while I kept that fur by the stove in a biscuit tin lined with newspaper. Later, I would hide it in a safety deposit box in Bellingham under my name. For months, I passed my thumb across those soft bristles, as if feeling for a pulse. We began to trade. I do not mean trade in the mercantile sense. That would summon crowds and men with shotgun racks. We traded in presents. I left a coffee tin with the lid half off and a cedar seat smoothed for it by the creek. It left back a line of small stones, a spiral of river rocks that told me it had seen what I had left, and had, in its awkward but intentional way, spoken back. Once, on a clear, cold morning, I found a polished round stone on my palm when I came in from splitting wood. The prints on the porch were too large for any man and too careful for a bear. I thought then, not that it was like a man, but that it had learned something like kindness. When I first tried to photograph it, the camera ate itself. That is not a fanciful way to say that the film developed blank. I mean, I pressed the Polaroid, watched the paper peel away, and it came back like an apology, soft, with nothing on it but the faint shadow of a tree. August, as I later named him in the margins of my journal in cheap blue ink, showed a reluctance for being caught, the way a shy beast will step aside when a miner sets a trap. He would allow, the gifts and the arrangements implied consent to connection, but the indignity of being displayed felt like a rupture to him. Some things are private in a way that paper cannot be. You can call him August if you must. I had been writing in my journals for years, Martha's grave dates, the mill's closing date, gas price shocks. I liked the association with the end of summer, with the slow reddening of leaves, and the way the light changes like a hinge. The name was mine. It was how I kept order. Nobody else had to use it. Around 1979, something shifted. The town changed both slowly and all at once. More pickups with chrome caps, the radio playing Springsteen on repeat for the first time, the price of a gallon of gas crossing that indignity of $1 in the speeches men made over the papers. Hunting seasons got longer, and the new men in town with their expensive scopes talked louder about tracking footprints than they did about faces. It was the kind of talk that makes you notice how easily people's hearts harden when their toys are shiny. One night in November, I heard the shotgun before I saw the headlights. It cracked twice, sharp enough that Maggie woke and whined, and the nearby woods answered like an old chorus. I ran down to the edge of the clearing and saw men with orange vests and flashlights, faces set up like they were solving a problem. I heard them laughing, low and mean. The beam of a flashlight found a path of overturned ferns and gnarled impressions in the mud. I recognized the scent of diesel and stale beer. I stepped forward because it was instinct and because the animals I knew did not flee with that wounded grace. The men shouted for me to mind my own business. One of them, a boy with the arrogance of someone who had never truly had to wait for anything, put his palm over his mouth and mimicked the sound August made. I remember thinking, in that plain and terrible way you think when everything is happening faster than your old joints can move, that we were all making too much noise. August did not answer the first shot. He answered the second with a sound that came out of the ground and was older than any word I have for it. He did not run. He turned and moved between the trees like he was walking through a curtain, leaving the men yelling into the dark. After that night, the men started leaving hunting gear at my porch. Maybe they thought me a useful ear, or perhaps they thought it would be fun to get a laugh from the old widower who swore he had seen something. Tom, from down the road, brought me a brass acorn. For luck, he said, and Joe Hendricks slapped my shoulder with the kind of rough affection reserved for men who have too many fears to name. They wanted to believe they'd almost had something to tell. I wanted the men to understand that almost was a dangerous place for a living thing. The hunters didn't sleep for long. The clear-cutting crews came in the 90s with their catalogs and their maps, and with maps come numbers that hide the lungs of a place. You learn to hate a machine when you can see how it eats through the understory. Trees that had stood since before my grandfather's time toppled like scored dominoes. Our boundary line, one old bend of hemlock where August liked to sit, became a sharp, cigarette-butt edge of stumps and sawdust. Before the cutters, there was 1985, and a woman standing at the edge of the clearing the same day I found a circle of stones. She wore a denim jacket and a bandana over her hair and had a pair of heavy boots that said she wasn't planning on much small talk. Sheila Lane was her name. She came from Bellingham with a camera, a notebook, and what I later learned was an interest in ethnobotany. She did not ask me to explain August. She watched, the way someone pays attention when they know what they might lose. Sheila was younger than me by a lot, and older than Maggie had been. She had the kind of laugh that made a place warmer for all it touched. The first time she saw the spiral of stones, she knelt and ran her fingers over the wet edges as if reading. She said, "Look at this! Someone's been doing rock sculptures." I said nothing. She looked up at me, and the gesture she made was careful and full of a thing I had almost forgotten, a willingness to believe in kindness without turning it into a headline. She started coming around. She taught me about plants I had used my whole life and never named properly. The liverwort in the hollows, the smell of crushed cedar bark as an antiseptic, the edible roots tucked in those shadowy banks. She taught me that the forest keeps a ledger and doesn't lose a single debt. In return, she listened to my stories in the evenings while we ate stew by the wood stove and the old radio picked up country music with a hiss. Once, after we had been living in that slow orbit for a year, August left a row of saplings planted in a neat small row where the loggers had marked for cutting. They were no more than single finger tall at the time, a childish, stubborn gesture, like someone drawing an X across a map. Sheila believed in writing things down and in photographs, but not in putting everything on display. When she took pictures of a pine cone arranged like a compass, she would develop the Polaroid and tuck the blank edge into her journal with the same reverence I used for the tuft of fur. Once, as if testing the limits of recognition, August arranged the stones into a pattern that, to a trained eye, or to a heart that wanted to see, looked like a warning. 3 small stones, followed by a larger one, then a clear space, and 3 small stones again. I have thought for years that it was a phrase, and that the larger stone was meant as some kind of period. There is a peculiar thing about living with an intelligence that will not speak in your tongue. You begin to reframe everything you do as a translation. When Sheila left in the winter of '86 to teach at the college in Bellingham, she left her Polaroid camera with me. "You keep it," she said. "If anything odd happens, take a picture. Keep my journals if you like." She left a small stack of her notebooks, spidery handwriting and all, and a thermos that always leaked a little. She was gone the way people leave towns. You know that a person has moved on, but you can still find where they sat. By the time the loggers moved in heavy, 1994 is the year I remember with a kind of shame. I had stopped believing my life would be quiet. They brought a wall of trucks, their engines hissed like an animal that never sleeps. And the first day you could see the sky where the trees used to be, I walked out to the edge and felt as if someone had punched a hole in the world. The boundary between green and sawdust was abrupt as a cut. In that margin, August sat with his back turned to the clearing and one enormous hand flat on a stump. He made the low sound and pressed a small, round stone into the heartwood until the earth took the stone like a wound. He did not look at me then, but his shoulders shook with a movement that could have been grief or fatigue. I tried to stand up for him in the town in my small, polite ways. I signed petitions. I went to the planning meetings, and I spoke in the thin, old voice of someone who had to say something without breaking a court rule. Men in suits used words like marginal yield and economic necessity, and where they saw numbers, I saw rings of fur turned into pulp. They passed around diagrams and photographs that were slick and clean. They showed the profit and the dotted lines of a road and called it progress. The thing about our little valley is that progress tastes like sawdust if you're not the one holding the payroll. There were confrontations. Men with names I had known my whole life came to my porch like they were going to have a chat. They offered me payoffs in the form of work. "Come back to the mill, Earl. They'll put you on for a few months." And I told them I'd rather split my wood and wait for the snow. The clear-cut grew like a sore, and the animals I had known for decades thinned out. Once, in the early summer, when the sap was singing in the trunks, I found a line of small poles with bright orange ribbon and the smell of new diesel. August had come to the boundary at night and arranged the poles in a crooked row with a single sapling bent across them like a hand trying to stop a train. I can't say whether August had a concept of time like ours. He did not age as we do. His fur silvered, yes, and he grew thinner, but there was a steadiness in him that outlived the cycles of crops and gas prices. He came and he left. He slept on the north side of the creek in winter, and in the summer, when the moss hung heavy and the rain made everything a shimmer, he would leave patterns of polished stones along the bank that shone if you wetted them with your hand. I learned how to read these things, the same way you learn to read a person by their small habits. Once he left a row of shells at the mouth of the creek, odd, in a place where the tide is a day's travel away. And I thought then that he had been to places beyond our maps, that he carried the ocean in his pockets like a secret. The attacks on him escalated after the loggers came. Metal and money change how humans see everything. Men who had never been hungry now looked at the woods as something to be measured and moved. Poachers came with clever traps and night vision that frightened me. We had one terrible night in 1995 after my shoulder had healed into a stiff but useful joint and Maggie had gone to sleep in a good box in the yard, when there was shouting and a bright flare that made the trees look like ghost posts. I ran toward the light and found only crushed foliage and a line of tracks into mud that were too big for a man's boot and too neat for a beast. The next morning, the loggers found a thing. No, not a creature, but the shed of something that had been caught in a cable. I won't describe what that shed looked like. It is enough to say that August limped for weeks after, with a scar across his flank, and that his visits thinned after that. People in town said I had lost my mind. They said it more politely than men with beers in their hands would say it to a stranger. They started to call the sheriff more often, and the sheriff started making rounds in his truck. Once, during a winter when the road was a sheet of black ice and everyone stayed indoors, a deputy knocked at my door. He had the flat look of a man who thinks his badge gives him an answer to everything. "We've had reports, Mr. Whitaker," he said. "You know, sightings." He did not ask if I had seen anything. He already had in his head the possibility of a man with a gun. It is in the small, private things you keep that truth often sits. I kept a handful of Polaroids that never quite came out of themselves, and a tuft of fur in a tin. I kept Sheila's journals in a box under the bed, and the brass acorn Tom had given me on a chain around my neck, because God knows one needs to carry small talismans. I had a ledger where I wrote dates. 9/17/1973, first contact. 11/19/1979, shotgun incident. 6/2/1985, Sheila arrives. 4/14/1994, first clear-cut line. 3/15/1998, last meeting. Those dates were like little stitches in a seam I could follow when memory frayed. The thing that mystery taught me, in slow, aching doses, was humility. When August put his palm to mine the first time in a way that did not hurt, more like weighing, as if to say, "Are you still here?" I realized that the measure of a life isn't in trophies or witnessed proofs, but in the hands that touch you. His palm was the size of my two hands together, warm and rough, smelling of moss and river clay. He pressed and then let go. I pressed back, like a man making an oral contract by clasping a hand. He did not sign a contract. He gave me a benediction. People ask what he said about our future. Men imagine words. He didn't speak. He arranged. The last full sentence I ever felt him make was a pattern of stones and stumps on the edge of the clear-cut that read to me like a warning if you were willing to learn its language. He laid out 3 small stones next to one large stump, then a gap, then another cluster like it. Around the stump he had rubbed the bark smooth with his hands until it shone. Then he placed a small tuft of fur on the stump like an offering. When I sat with him that day, he put his huge hand on my knee and held it there for a long time. I felt a sadness there that made me want to cry like a child, but I was an old man, so I cursed instead, and the sound broke into a laugh that startled both of us. He did something else then that I have never told without my throat closing. He reached down to the log and split a piece of cedar with his weight, and from the split oozed a clear sap that dripped like a slow clock. August took that sap and smeared it over the stump, and then, with some care I still can't explain, he pressed his palm into the sap until the print was there, a handprint on bleeding wood. It was not a human handprint. It was a mark like a sign hung in a doorway. I understood then, in a way older than thought, that his message was not to me alone. It was to anyone who could read such things. Care for what you cut, for the world loves its own and will not forever answer kindly to being taken. In the spring of 1998, on March 15th, the weather held a stubborn chill. The creek had thawed, but the banks were clotted with last season's leaves. The loggers were gone. The town was quieter. The mill had shut for good the year before, and men were learning new ways to be useless, or useful in ways that did not feed the bones. Sheila had moved to a university 2 towns over, and Tom's boy had a baby, and people began to notice the edges of their lives in a soft, surprised way. I walked down to the clearing as if to pay a debt, a habit more than anything else, and there he was, sitting on the same stump with his back to the open sky. There was no drama. He did not rise to a roar or collapse in a fever. He sat, and I sat beside him. The sun came through the firs in a way that turned his hair to thin threads of metal. He put his hand on my knee, and it trembled a little. He arranged a few small stones in a circle and left a single tuft of fur in the middle. Then, with a motion so slow it could have been a thought, he reached out his other hand and touched the earth. He looked at me long, and then, the way I have always understood it, he said in the old language of gesture and arrangement, "Look." Look, I did. I let my eyes travel the horizon where the trees used to be, and returned to the stump and the stones and the small tuft that smelled faintly of cedar and a sweetness like old rain. I felt a pressure in my chest, not exactly grief, not exactly warning, but the sense of a ledger being balanced. He took my hand and placed a small round pebble into my palm, and then withdrew his own hand and held mine open as if to say, "Keep this." He put his head down and made a sound low in his throat that could have meant sorrow or acceptance. We sat together until the light went soft. I offered him nothing. There was nothing to offer that meaningfully repaid the sum of what had been given. He rose without a sound and walked into the tree line toward the creek. At the last moment, he turned his head and looked at me once more. I wanted to say something grand enough to hold him there, something about not leaving, about promises, about the future. But the thing that came out was small. "Take care," I said. He nodded, if one can call that a nod, and then he was gone. They say he vanished that night and did not come back. Some men claimed to have seen him later on the highway, a shadow by the roadside. Others found strange arrangements of stone and reported them like one reports the weather. I never saw him the way I had in those first reckless months again. But I kept the pebble he had placed in my palm, tucked into the same biscuit tin with the tuft of fur, and I have carried it in my pocket for years, feeling its smoothness when the nights become harder to stand. What it said about our future is not a headline. It was a gentle, terrible truth folded into the way it made a handprint on sap, and how it left a turf of stones in the cleared ground. It said, in the only way it could, "The choice you make at the edge of a forest does not stay at the edge. It carries inwards like smoke. It will touch the creek, the moss, the small lives you never thought you would meet. If you continue to value short, quick profit over patience and presence, the world will answer in ways that will make you small." That is alarming because it asks something of us that is harder than any law. It asks us to be less useful and more careful. I do not tell this to win a debate or to make you believe me. I tell it because I have held the stones and the tuft of fur, and because I have sat with a creature so large it made men forget how unimportant they were in the face of a life not theirs to command. I have both the evidence and the humility. You can take it or leave it. Some of you will mock. Some of you will buy a t-shirt and go to the nearest trail and look for footprints. Others will put your head down and wonder what small changes you can make. There are things I still regret. I regret the nights when I kept my house radio on, filling the silence with canned laughter and talk, when I could have been listening to the creek. I regret the times I told myself there was nothing to be done. I regret that we let the saws come where the saplings should have stood. I regret that a creature as gentle and terrible as August had to act the way he did to be heard. But regret, I have learned, is only useful if it changes what you will do next. If you take anything from this story, let it be this: the future is not imposed upon us like a weather report. It is negotiated with each choice we make, and often the negotiation is with things that do not speak our language. Listen for the arrangements, the stones, the tufts, the quiet hands on your knee. There is wisdom there if you will keep your eyes open and your hands less quick. I keep writing this because it is the only way I know to pass along the ledger I have lived. My journals are full of dates and small sketches of stone patterns. Sheila's notebooks are filled with plant names and recipes for salves. The Polaroids never turned themselves into proof. They are, at best, a suggestion. The tuft of fur waits in a tin. The pebble is smooth. The stump is still there, leaning black and clever. I go down sometimes and run my hand over the sap where his palm left a print, and I whisper like a man talking to a god he hardly knows. We will try. I do not know whether we will, not in ways that matter beyond my little valley. I know only what I felt in the press of that enormous, foolish, wise palm, and in the pattern of stones that read like a warning crossed with a benediction. There is an alarming thing in that combination. If you choose greed and noise, you will get noise and emptiness in return. If you choose steadiness, you might just keep a few trunks standing for your grandchildren. Sometimes, after a long day, I take Sheila's old Polaroid camera down from the shelf and peel a blank picture and lay it beneath the porch light to warm. The paper never fills in the way I want it to. Nothing photographs the way it feels to be present with a living creature who is older than your institutions. But the habit keeps me honest. The town goes on. People are born. People die. The Mills lot became a field of tall grass where the kids fly kites. I am older now. I have learned how much of life is carrying what you cannot change and how much is changing what you can. The pebble is in my pocket as I write this. When a neighbor's grandson wanders too close to the creek, I tell him to stay away from the edge and to look instead for the small stones. Pick one up, I tell him. Put it in your pocket. Remember it. He scoffs because children scoff at prophecies that ask them to be patient. But he picks a pebble anyway, because children are softer than their faces tell you. There have been men who tried to make a show of things. There were the usual rumors that a sighting would be paraded on television, that the world would rush in with cameras and lights. I never wanted that. August was never meant for any audience. His messages were private, carved in river stone and cedar sap. They were not meant to be headlines. They were meant to be kept. And so I keep them. I keep my ledger of dates. I keep the circumference of the stones. I tell the story to keep the memory of a hand on my knee and a tuft of fur in a biscuit tin alive. Maybe that is all any of us can promise, to pass on the things that taught us better. If this story has touched you, if you find in it any stubbornness of hope, then do something small tonight. Take a walk without a purpose beyond noticing. Listen to the creek. Put down the radio for a while. If you think this channel helps carry stories like mine, stories that ask you to care about what cannot speak for itself, consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who still knows what a Polaroid feels like when it warms in your hands. There is more. There are winter nights with frozen breath, and a patrol that left a note on my porch. There is a story about a man from a neighboring county who came with intentions he could not name. There is the way August arranged the stones after the last cutting, and how I tried to translate that arrangement into a public plea and was laughed at. I will tell you those things, because they are part of how the ledger balanced and how the warning widened into a simple life lesson. But for now, I will fold up Sheila's journal, tuck the tuft of fur back into its tin, and go check the creek for the night. The moon is a thin coin tonight, and in the dark you can sometimes hear the trees breathing if you stand still long enough. The stones at the creek have settled into their recent places. Sometimes I think I can still see the outline of a large hand on the stump, a ghost in sap. If you want to keep listening, there's more to come. The hunter who learned too late. The man who took a trophy and what that trophy took from him. And the last pattern of stones that, if read right, offers both a lament and a map. For now, though, the story pauses, like a breath held between two notes, waiting for someone to step back into rhythm. The moon thinned to a sliver, and the creek kept its small, stubborn music. The air sliced at my lungs until every breath sounded like a promise I could not keep. But he had always wanted a trophy. It sat inside him like a splinter. He told the story himself when he told it, and he told it in the tone of a man who expected the room to rise up and give him applause. He said he had seen the stump at dusk, when sap turned black and the light found edges no one else noticed. He said he had not meant to be cruel. He said curiosity is a poor defense, but a persistent one. He had gone to the stump with a blade and a borrowed plane, and he had taken a piece of bark, just a piece, he claimed, no larger than a man's palm. He bound it and brought it home, and he nailed it above his mantle to keep the story warm. What the bark took from him was not immediate. At first it was small things, a lightness lifted from his nights, a dream that would not stop playing, August's hand moving like a slow tide, the stones rearranging themselves into directions that ended in an empty field. Then the dog stopped obeying. Later, his boy came home with a jar of questions no one could answer. The hunter's laugh thinned. He found himself waking at 1 in the morning, hands at the mantle as if to check the bark's heartbeat. He tried to tell himself that the dread was only weather. He smoked more. The bread burned. One evening, he came to my porch with the piece of bark wrapped in newspaper. He wanted advice. I thought I'd done right, he said. And the rawness in him made me think of young sheep exposed too soon. He hadn't done right, I told him, not with the bluntness he expected, but with a steadiness I had learned from August, words that land and wait. He could not bear to keep it, but he feared letting it go. Where take it, he asked. Everyone in town had an answer that lined up with their own conscience. Someone said to bury it, safer to hide. Someone else said burn it, to turn the thing to ashes and so undo it. He listened to each and left with the bark heavier than when he had come. A week later, his truck slid off the road in a place where the black ice collects like secret. He was found with his hands still remembering the shape of the bark. They said he'd fallen asleep. They said the road was treacherous and that grief makes a poor driver. I do not know the measure of what the bark took. I know the way men count loss, funerals and folded shirts, an empty place at the table that the town marks with polite gestures, like laying a hand on a shoulder. The boy who had once scoffed at my pebble now kept 3 stones in his pocket, and he would not tell me why. When the county man returned, he had a different kind of hunger. He brought small instruments that clicked in the cold, and a notebook that smelled faintly of lemon and worry. He wanted to map the patterns August had left. He called them arrangements. He called them design and heritage and cultural history in tones that were meant to feel like safety. People ought to know, he said. If there's a system, if there's anything to learn, how else will it be preserved? Showed him the ledger. I showed him the stones as they lay and the measurements I had kept over the months. 3 at the creek, an angle like a thumb at the stump, a spiral that broke off where the heavy hand had lifted. I explained, clumsy as a man explaining prayer, that the stones were not for everyone, that some things are not to be learned by calculation. He laughed then, but it was a small laugh meant to soften a rebuke. "You mean superstition," he said. Others in the town thought the same. They liked the idea of things being streamable into knowledge and sold as wonders. After that, I tried to make the arrangement public in a way a man can. I arranged the stones along the main path by the post office and wrote a short plea, an appeal that read like a petition and like a warning both. The paper fell like snow on the floor of the cafe. People read it, folded it, and their eyes slid away. One woman said I was making trouble where none existed. Another muttered that the stones were childlike art. They applauded the county man's maps. They laughed when I said the stones read like a map and a lament. To laugh is easier than looking. August's arrangements, though, did not mind laughter. Stones have their own patience. When they had been set after the last cutting, they drew a line like a river's regret and pointed outward. I sat with the pattern that evening until my knees bent and my shoelaces froze to the earth. There are shapes humans name, and shapes animals live by. August had left one of the latter. It was not a map to treasure. It was a map to what remains when you listen. The sheltering trees, the places to plant, the patches of earth to keep untouched. Months later, when the men who thought they understood maps tried to straighten the pattern into a geometrical proof, the stones had already changed under frost and root and small rodent digging. They are not docile to human ambition. They slip and rearrange. They are, in that way, honest. You can try to bend them to your will, but the world has a different arithmetic. The patrol's note stayed in my ledger. Sometimes I thought the county man had friends in different uniforms, and that those friends left notes so that later someone else would not return and claim ignorance. Other times I thought the note was merely the town's attempt to be safe. Leave the strange things alone and nobody gets into trouble. Trouble came anyway. It came the day a man with a camera, smaller than any professional gear but noisier for its attentions, arrived at dawn. He stood at the field's edge and watched the stump like a man who expects the object of his gaze to perform. He wore a jacket that said he belonged somewhere whose seasons were not ours.
I found him staring at the stones, fingers in his pockets, as if searching for a lighter to burn what he could not read. He stepped closer without asking. He did not notice me until I cleared my throat. Some things don't like being watched.
He smiled in the way men smile when they think they've found the last page of a story, he said. He had a pamphlet, a small glossy thing, with other stumps in other towns and quotes clipped to the margins. He called his work conservation and exposure. He wanted to lift August's hand into the light, as if light could explain color. I told him, as politely as I knew how, that August had been private as a man can be, that the hand on the stump was a weight and a question, and that the stones were not props. He did not listen. He photographed the tufts in the biscuit tin, the scuffed ledger where my dates looped like careful fingers, the sap where the palm had left its print. He left with his camera full, and for a week the town's inbox filled with the kind of eager etiquette that wants to learn how to care from postcards. They asked where they could see the exhibit. They asked whether the stump could be moved to a museum that would preserve it. They were polite. They were hungry. When the hunter's funeral passed, we said the things townfolk say at such rites. We cried and ate and moved with the small deputized kindnesses that grief ordains. The boy, now older by the knife of loss, came to my porch and took the tuft from the biscuit tin. He did not ask, he did not protest. He held it as if it were the only remaining language between him and his father. That night he stayed longer than he should have, and arranged 3 stones on my table in a pattern none of my sketches held. It was a child's hand, crude and precise. He did not tell me what the stones meant. He only said he wanted to make something of it. There are many ways to read a child's pattern. One can be tender and project a future. Or one can be an old man who reads caution and keeps his ledger open to the next page. The boy's stones pointed away from the stump, not toward it. They opened like a fist loosening. In that, I felt an answer to August's quiet. Some things must be let go so that they do not become trophies for those who would be hallowed by them. The county man returned in spring with a group who wore ties even in the heat. They took notes in a rhythm that felt like a metronome for decisions. There were murmurs about restrictions, about conservancy and regulation, and, beneath those words, money's good manners. They asked for my permission to study the grove and to catalog the stumps. They wanted to attach signs, to label. A man from the group asked, in a tone that meant both curiosity and contract, "If the pattern is a map, where does it lead?" I answered as best I could. It leads to the place you refuse to break. It leads to the unprofitable corners you keep. It leads, perhaps, to a bench where a boy will someday sit, a different story than the ones we sell. They nodded as if I had given them a riddle, and they liked the riddle because it left them room to spend. That summer, a rumor traveled through town like a wind carrying seed. A developer in the county, someone with a ledger full of different dates, wanted the land. He wanted to cut beyond the boundary, to make a corridor where once the woodland had resisted. Men who count growth in numbers began to speak of profit. Men who count growth in seasons said no. The old arguments resumed, rewrapped in newer paper. I have not been a man of confrontation often. My life has been slow work, ledger ink, peeled Polaroids, a biscuit tin that closes with the faint sound of a church bell. But there are things you recognize as stakes. I spent the summer writing letters, arranging stones along roads, speaking with the man from the county until patience and hospitality had been used thin. People would come to the stump now and take a picture and leave, like those who skim a book at the library and go on as if they had been visited by the truth. That is the hardest kind of visitation, the one that leaves you polished and empty. One night in late August, when the light had the tired gold of a season ready to fold, someone burned a path through the underbrush with a chainsaw. The sound came like a wound, sudden and mechanical against the slow music of life. It woke me from a sleep where August's hand still pressed against the inside of my skull. I went out with a lamp and a heart that was not completely my own. They had cut a clean notch into a younger tree at the field's edge. It was not the stump I cared for, but the look of it. Hands that would have grown, sap that might have built shelter for birds and boys. Someone had marked a line of intent. When you cut one place in a community, you open a ledger that others can sign. The neighbor's grandson found me there, crouched and whispering to a ring of stones the way one might whisper to a psalm. He had mud on his knees and a seriousness on his face that belonged to people who inherit more than they asked for. "They'll come soon," he said. "People from the roads, the ones with measuring tape." I pocketed the pebble I had given him years ago and felt its smooth insistence. We went back to the porch. I made a pot of coffee with water that tasted faintly of iron and old rain. He told me, in the small way of those who are young and prideful enough to feel invisible, that he'd been watching men in trucks mark trees with orange paint. They had taken a picture of the stump and left with their flash and a promise of return. He had put 3 stones in his pocket. He had not yet learned where to set them. "We'll keep them," he said. We sat with that as if it were a plan. Later, I walked the boundary line at dawn and found fresh tire marks heading into the wood. A man had come in the night and walked the perimeter. He had a lantern that had gone out. He had not taken anything, but he had left prints of the sort that want to be read. The ledger is full of these small testimonies, dates like tally marks of seasons. There are spaces that I have left blank for reasons I have not named. The county man sends letters now less often, and men in suits send others. The boy who carries stones like prayers grows taller, and his pockets are no longer childish. Sometimes he brings me a Polaroid, one that never comes out quite right, a pale ghost where life should print itself more heavy, and points to the place where he imagines a new tree might stand. "We can plant there," he says. "We can let something grow where they want to take it." There are people who think the right thing is public talk and petitions and regulated fences. There are people who think the right thing is to make a spectacle so large it cannot be ignored. I have a different theory. It is quieter. It asks for small, stubborn actions: to plant, to watch, to remember, to pick up a pebble and keep it in the wet winter months when everything else goes numb. I have arranged the stones again and again. Each time the pattern shifts as if breathing. The last arrangement August left, one that I tried to read as both cry and instruction, has been the hardest to translate into common language. It is a pattern that opens and invites, then closes and shelters. When I took it to the town square and tried to tell people that it meant, in crude terms, a place to stop and not to take, they laughed and called it superstition. They used words like folklore and charm as if meaning could be softened by packaging. They photographed the stones instead of listening. And yet the stones keep their counsel. They rearrange in the night. They tilt toward the creek when rain comes. They point away from where someone would make a road. A map that is also a lament is not interested in the applause of men with business cards. Winter will come again. The patrol left another note this week, and someone new drove through, leaving prints that were not theirs to leave. The county man will return, with new faces and new questions. Men will argue their ledgers and their interests and their rights. But there are also small hands learning to keep things. The boy with his 3 stones, neighbors who close their gates and leave their bulbs unplanted, a woman who brings extra bread to the place where the stump hangs between being memory and relic. Sometimes, when the town quiets and the creek is a silver tongue under its skin, I go out to the stump and place my palm where August's once pressed. Sap gathers under my fingertips like an old promise. I do not know if the pattern will ever become a sign strong enough to stop men who count by profit. I do not know if the hunter's story will have taught the others what it took to him. I only know this: the stones remember in ways we forget. They mark both where we failed and where we might try again.
There are more stories to tell of the man who took a trophy and what that trophy took. The county measures that nearly became deeds. The night the trucks came and were met by a line of hands and a child's stones placed in the road. There is the last pattern that, if read rightly, offers both a lament and a map. For now, though, the creek keeps its small music and the moon a thin coin. I close Sheila's journal and lift the biscuit tin. The tuft of fur warms between my hands like a thing forgiven. I step to the porch, lock the door, and listen long and careful for any sound that might not be meant for me. A track in the snow catches my eye, a set of prints that lead not away, but back toward the stumps, small and deliberate. They are not fresh enough to be made this hour, and not old enough to be yesterday's. They look as if someone walked the boundary, thought better of it, and returned. I follow them a short way, feeling the ledger in the pocket of my coat, and find a small string of stones laid with a child's slowness, each one placed like a bead on a thread of intent. The last stone is turned on its side so that it points north, not to a road, but to a hollow where a sapling leans like a promise. I do not know who set them. I only know that someone did. That, in itself, is a beginning. I turn back for the house, and the biscuit tin, and the ledger, and the Polaroid that will never show what the inside of a hand feels like. I choose for tonight to leave the porch light on.